Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. For all the returning listeners and subscribers, thank you for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. It goes a long way in promoting the channel. A few days ago, I was on an episode of Left Reckoning discussing Kayfabe, episode 1, that is live on Means TV. That's right, Kayfabe and all the other video essays we put out over the last few years are exclusively on Means. Please check me out on Left Reckoning. Subscribe to that channel if you don't already. Great analysis from some great guys. Don't forget to go to Means TV and check out all the other amazing left content they host. Excuse me. If you use the discount code, This is Revolution, all one word, you can get a subscription 20% off monthly or yearly. Again, This is Revolution, all one word, to receive a 20% off discount on your monthly or yearly subscription. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about our topic of the day, racial capitalism. That's why you guys really came here. Is there legitimacy in the scrutiny in the work of Karl Marx to say that he did not understand or that he flat out ignored race in his analysis of capitalism? Well, in 1983, an academic named Cedric Robinson wrote the book Black Marxism to expose the flaws of Marxism and to call out Black socialist thinkers as men who had gone astray from the Black radical tradition. Black Marxism, a book written during the height of anti-communist Cold War propaganda, is quite the anti-communist text, yet it still resonates with left scholars and young leftists to this day. Frank Wilderson's Afro-pessimism has roots in the ontological explanation of race and racism that is found in Robinson's work. Robinson writes about racial capitalism, a distinct form of capitalism that predates all historical material examples of primitive accumulation and Europe's enclosure. Our guest today, political scientist, professor, and author, challenges Robinson's analysis in his latest article for Nonsite. In our guest's rather astute critique of Black Marxism, he writes, "This Black intellectual culture of the Reagan-Bush years, descendant from the new Negro autodidacts of the 20s and Black power nationalism of the 60s, was characterized by race-first politics, broad intellectual curiosity, voracious reading, valuation of public oratory and debate, deep skepticism of Western knowledge claims, a belief in the cultural unity of diverse African populations, and, in some corners, Black cultural and moral superiority, a penchant for grand historical narrative, and acceptance of the racial divide as an immutable social fact. All of these characteristics are reflected in Robinson's Black Marxism. To my mind, this late Cold War Black nationalist subculture is still where Robinson's 1983 book belongs in terms of intellectual lineage. In Black Marxism, Robinson engages some of the authors from this milieu. These Black nationalist arguments are more central to the origins and substance of Robinson's claims and limitations than earlier uses of the phrase racial capitalism in the United States and South Africa, which in most cases were explicitly Marxist. That is a quote from our guest and friend. Tonight we will explore Cedric Robinson's 1983 book, Black Marxism, what it gets right, what it gets wrong, and the ahistorical framework of racialized capitalism. To do that with me, I have my homie, my dog, my co-host, the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He's the king of Miami. He is the Pascal Robert.
Hey. Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
This is a good one. Are you excited for this one?
I'm excited.
And coming all the way live from a cool jazz bar in Illinois, he is the only Cedric we need to discuss today, Cedric Johnson.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, man, you are one of the favorites over here, Cedric, as you probably know. Definitely one of our favorites. I know it's hard to get you, But when we do, it's always worth having you on the show.
Very
Thank
true.
you. Glad
Do
to
you,
be
do
here.
you want to here? We'll get the first one out of the way. Number one, I guess I want to know: was this an assignment for you? Did Non-Site reach out to you, or is this something that you wanted to do yourself? Because not that Black Marxism is the longest book; it is a dense book. I'm not the biggest fan of Robinson's writing style. It is extremely academic, and being a junior college dropout, it's a little over my head. But what made you want to take this on, or did you pick the shortest straw?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story. So I read this book back in the 1990s when I was a grad student, and I was drawn to it like so many other people by the title, right, and
Mhm.
also by the fact that this guy was also named Cedric, right. There were a lot of good things about it, and also the fact that he was a political scientist, right. I was in a government and politics PhD program. And it was tough to find other political scientists who would actually write about Marxism in the 1990s. I mean, it was still at that time a subject that was off limits. And so when I stumbled across this book, I had to get it. And I don't think I relate this in the article, but I couldn't afford to buy it. So I remember photocopying a
Damn.
version of it. Probably destroyed my retinas, doing that. But yeah, so I read it back then, because when I saw it, it was so intriguing to me. And then once I started reading it, I realized that it was very different than the kind of book I was expecting. That what I recognized in it, and it kind of resonates with the quote that you just read about the autodidacts from the New Negro period, as well as Black Power nationalists. I recognize a lot of Black nationalism that I had grown up with in the text. Some of the arguments he was making about racism, and really, his criticisms of Marx, I had heard, since teenage years, so since back to the 1980s, and it took me a while to really get to the point where I was willing to criticize it. I mean, the book kind of didn't really become popular until the 2000s.
Yeah.
And even more so with Black Lives Matter. It seems like it really took off then. But
Well, they were trained Marxists, so shouldn't they have known that this book wasn't about what they said they were trained in? Or were they
Right.
trained in a different kind of Marxism? Was there Marxism like the Aikido of Marxism?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think other people call them Marxists more than themselves, right? At least some of these folks.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, what I found out much later is that wasn't the title that Robinson wanted, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, he didn't. That wasn't his choice. That was the choice of Zed, the original publisher. But that title actually contradicts what the book is about, right? The subtitle is maybe more accurate, right? It should be, um, the making of the Black radical tradition probably makes more sense as his title. Um, but yeah, I pretty much forgot about that book, right? I mean, it was important to me in the 1990s, and then it's only in recent years as I've seen it kind of take off in popularity. I've been inspired to write something, and like you said, it's not an easy book to get through, and so to write something about it meant having to go back and read it with fresh eyes. And I got pulled into a conference in Brazil, and I think that's where the non-site. That was back at the end of 2023. That's where the non-site article comes from. It was originally written for a Brazilian publication, and then we published the English version in non-site.
Pascal, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, what's really fascinating to me is that, I would have thought that the thing that drew you to write this article was how much bad politics of Black thought today is driven by this book, and
Right.
how much of the politics of many of the thought leaders, and I think it's safe to say we, as well as yourself, as well as anyone else in the Reed tradition, have found basically problematic, takes argumentation from this book. And the term that many people would use to describe them now is the one coined by our fellow comrade Torrey Reed, is the race reductionists among us, particularly. But the only thing that differentiates them is that they could be race reductionists who call themselves anti-capitalists.
Right.
And what's fascinating about that clique of individuals is that this is the first generation of people who call themselves socialists, I find, who are stuck on the racial element and deny the overall class and diminish the class element overall, and hearken back to the race first socialists of the late 60s and early 70s that you found. And that's why when I was reading your article and you made the direct lineage, which I've heard the South African allegation that's where he got the term racial capitalism. I was always dubious of that. But when you made the clear lineage to the black race first nationalism, particularly revolutionary nationalism, that, by the way, revolutionary nationalists consider themselves Marxist. Many people don't realize that. But how much of that politics did stake itself on a racialization of the narrative of history? Your article clarifies that, and it's clear explaining how much Cedric Robinson draws from that. That is really his origin story, intellectually, is that period of time. And another thing you said that's important is that he doesn't really explain the black socialists and communists that existed in the early 20th century. He doesn't give them any, he acts almost like they didn't even exist in his book. He pays no attention to them. And what does this say to this black radical tradition? Who is in the black radical tradition and who is out? Exactly. That's never been clarified specifically to me.
I think
so. I mean, there's a lot which
can you hear us, Cedric? You're breaking up a little bit.
I can hear you all.
Okay, now we can hear you. Now
can you hear me, or am I still frozen up?
No, you're we can hear you now. So what were you saying?
So let me try to build on what Scott there's at least capitalisms, right? There's the racial capitalism from people like Bob Blauner, who was a white sociologist who drawed heavily or extensively from Black Power thinking. There's the racial capitalist idea that we get from South African communists. And then there's the racial capitalism as it's developed by Robinson, which doesn't really have a whole lot to do with those earlier notions, which, as I point out in the article, are really more Marxist, right? And then we could also point out that people have taken up Robinson today. They've used the notion of racial capitalism in ways that really don't have a whole lot to do with what he said. There's moments where he's actually anti-capitalist. I would say he is, but in a utopian sense, and in a sense that's closer to some of the 19th century, utopian thinkers that Marx and Engels criticized. And so I do think that he has a criticism of capitalism, but it's one which is anti-Marxist, and it's not anchored in this idea of building broad-based, working class centered, political movements. And instead, he's critical of Western Marxism. He's critical of this idea that somehow we can build in the United States or elsewhere broad and powerful, and cosmopolitan social struggles. Instead, he kind of stakes out his claim on something, again, that just sounds very similar to old styles of Black nationalism, this idea that Black people, have a different view of the world, a different perspective, and different ways of knowing, which we need to tap into. And those themselves are important, and what they might pose the alternative to the world that we're in, right? And I think he would probably argue that even Marxists are still committed to some of the problematic assumptions that come out of the making of the modern world. So there's a lot going on there. And I think I would encourage everybody, who's listening, to take up the book themselves. There's some important parts of it. It's a book that I find to be really engaging in some moments, but it's also deeply contradictory, right? So, for instance, in some moments he'll quote people who argue that there was no racism in antiquity, right? There's no racism in Greek and Roman society, right? That there were people, what we might call now people of color, people from Northern Africa, other places that circulated through those Mediterranean civilizations. But there was no racial prejudice because people from Northern Africa did not encounter Greeks and Romans strictly as slaves, right? They encountered as statesmen, as merchants, as soldiers, and all sorts of different social roles. And so it's only much later, it seems that he's arguing in the original script that racism emerges, right? It emerges during the feudal period. But then in the 2000 preface that he writes, he actually does make the argument that there was kind of racist ideology, or racialist is the term he uses, in antiquity, and he uses, I think, Aristotle to make that point. So there's a lot of contradictory things, and we can summarize some of it here, but again, I would encourage people to take it up and really spend some time reading it, because there's a way that it kind of like says things and then completely contradicts those things in other parts of the text.
Did you want to say something, Pascal?
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, I haven't read the text since the earlier aughts. I mean, I was revisiting Black sociologist scholarship, and I remember actually asking in an email Adolf Reed about the text, and he never responded. So I always take that as to say that he was like, yeah, you don't have to read that shit. But he's never been particularly friendly towards it, and I think he fundamentally saw it as an anti-Marxist text that was being passed as a book by a Black Marxist, which it's not.
He is not a
Marxist.
Right. Robinson argues that Marxism fails to account for the deep-seated nature of racialism within European culture. How does this critique challenge traditional Marxist theories of capitalism?
Right. So the general sense that we have, right, I think those of us on the left have made this argument for years, is that racism, as we know it, is a product of European expansion, colonization, the conquest of indigenous peoples, and it emerges a bit later as a justification for those new relationships, right? The relationships of dominance and subordination, and the new regimes, right? The labor regimes that emerge in the colonies, in the Western Hemisphere, and that's an argument that's been made for a long time, and I think it's one that most of us accept. What Robinson does is make the case that racism starts earlier, but he uses the term racialist to kind of distinguish it. He's talking about various forms of prejudice, in particular, the treatment of the Irish, right? And he even argues that Marx and Engels don't quite spend enough time talking about the ways in which these forms of difference mattered in the initial emergence of capitalism. And it's not helpful, right? And I think there are many other, more useful understandings of the emergence of racism that I would rely on, in particular, the works of people like Stephen Jay Gould or Barbara Fields, a whole host of people who've given us a clear sense of when race as a concept emerges. And I think Fields says it best when she points out that, racism is a type of prejudice, but all forms of prejudice are not racism. And so I don't think it's helpful to declare whatever kinds of nationalist exclusion or tribalism we might have found in feudal Europe as racism. We could say it was maybe proto-racial, right? Or it prefigured the emergence of racism. But racism as we know it really begins to take shape closer to the time of the American Revolution. I mean, it's in the work of scientists, of botanists, and various persons who are trying to categorize various species. Germans like Linnaeus and later Johann F. Blumenbach, who really begin to give some form to these ideas about there being different subspecies of human beings. And really begin to talk about, in the case of Blumenbach, social hierarchies that aren't just national and felt, but that can be seen across very vast global distances and expanses, right? And we find it again as well during the colonial period in the U.S. and revolutionary period with Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean, Jefferson is really clear in offering his ideas about the unique characteristics of enslaved, Africans, right, in his midst. And I really just think Robinson's arguments aren't particularly helpful. But to go back to Pascal's original point, it is helpful for people in our own times who don't want to talk about capitalism as the main driver of so much of the inequality that we experience now, and who are committed for whatever reasons to this idea that racism is just as important of an historical driving force in our society as the capitalist economy. And so I just think it provides a means of egress for many folks who don't really want to have a full-on discussion of capitalism. And, let's just be honest, right? I mean, I know Jason evoked the Black Lives Matter founders, a bit earlier, but this plays well in a particular kind of environment of funding through foundations. It plays well within the world of nonprofits. It plays well within academic circles, right? I mean, I've had moments where I've applied for grants, in academia. I don't know too many people who get big grants for making Marxist anti-capitalist arguments. I mean, but there are people who embrace racial capitalism because it's a way of signaling on one level a consciousness of economy, and that might rest on like a racial disparity argument or some sort of focus on real estate or something like that. And then at the same time, it foregrounds anti-racism, racial capitalism, and it also sidesteps on decades worth of serious scholarship by academics, by activists, all sorts of people who've not only acknowledged the problem of racism, as Marx and Engels do, in various places, but they've also looked at how racial prejudice has been mobilized by capital at various moments to divide the working class, the hiring of Black people as scabs before them, the hiring of Irish as scabs, the hiring of Italians, all sorts of different groups of newcomers who are then pitted against the more established workers in different sectors, right? So we've seen this played out over and over again. It's not a mystery. It's not something that's been hidden from us. It's well known. And so I just think that the turn to racial capitalism in our own times just provides a safe means of saying we got that, right? Yeah, of course, capitalism, but we want to, we really want to focus on a kind of anti-racist politics because we see that as the most important. But I think the way to think about, again, Robinson's popularity, it just goes along with the zeitgeist to this moment, right? Where, so many people have, spent a tremendous amount of time trashing the idea that that there are commonalities among working class people in this country, that there are common grounds that might, provide the basis for powerful popular struggles to take hold. And we've also seen people trash the idea that has even happened in the United States in the past, right? And so it almost gets erased completely in some of the popular discourses about the making of the country. And I think, again, Robinson's work, as serious as it might be in many respects, in today's climate, it actually provides comfort to people who are anti-Marxist and who are not concerned about building the kinds of social struggles that we need to really change this country.
Did you want to follow up with that, Pascal?
Yes, what's interesting to me about this class of individuals, the foundation world coming out of Black Lives Matter, academics, etc., who never would want to stake their politics on being true Marxists, anti-capitalists, or socialists in the tradition of, the old line that would primarily use capitalism to explain the condition of Black people. But instead, what we get is rad libs or anti-racist liberalism that's designed to fundamentally fit Black people or Black workers into the capitalist hierarchy, but just looking for rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic without addressing the core problem of distribution within capitalism.
Right. Right.
So
now,
can you address for me how the disparitarian logic, racial disparities, which I find one of the most sabotaging mechanisms to end any type of logic of coalition building, how that becomes popular in the wake of, say, the birth of a socialist consciousness around Bernie Sanders, almost too. If I had to say, it's so cynical to say almost was this planned in the way the timing of this stuff comes about, as to say that, these socialists don't understand race.
Right. No, that's great. That's a great question. So let me say a few things, in response to that. I mean, we have to deal with the fact that, maybe the high tide of a socialist politics in this country was really the New Deal period, right? The era of the Popular Front, and or as I guess Michael Denning refers to, the Cultural Front. This idea that you had for a moment a broad sense within the country that people were sympathetic towards some socialist ideas. I think a quarter of Americans, during that period in the 1930s, supported socialism, and maybe another 35% were open to the idea. And that was from a poll that was taken in Fortune magazine, right? And so, there was a high tide of popularity and of acceptance of that. And we saw it manifested in so many different aspects of the society at that particular time, in popular culture, but also in various social struggles that were unfolding. After World War II, there's an active campaign to defeat socialism within the labor movement, and also within mass cultural institutions, right? In particular in Hollywood, because, clearly enough, capital was fearful of what would happen if these ideas continued to spread. And so, as I've noted in other work that I've done, and I'm certainly not the first one to do this, the transformation of American life after World War II, in particular, the expansion of cities, the making of a property owning middle class in suburbia, all has the effect of really killing, whatever momentum socialism might have had, during the Depression years. And we're still dealing with that, right? And what happens at the same time, and this goes to Pascal's point, during that same period in which, a Communist Party members of various kinds of socialists are being persecuted within the country, right? And within the civil rights movement as well, targeted and persecuted. At that very same, during that very same period, the idea that race is the main axis of conflict really begins to have a moment of renewal in American life, right? It becomes one way of, and of course it's true in a sense that there's Jim Crow segregation, right? So it is a scourge in the society, but the idea that somehow it is the primary conflict is one that really begins to take root at that particular time. And even now, it's a safer one for us to have a conversation about. And I think to come back to the disparities argument, there's a few reasons why it's become dominant in my mind, right? Part of it has to do with the subprime mortgage crisis and the ways in which the subprime mortgage crisis really decimated the conditions of the Black middle class. I mean, places like Detroit, before the subprime mortgage crisis, you had over 70% of the mortgages in that town were owned by Black people. After the subprime mortgage crisis, that is more than cut in half. And so that kind of scenario is repeated around the country. And it's easy for these writers at the Atlantic, at the New Yorker, and the New York Times to talk about this, because this has been the running script since the Cold War, to focus on the persistence of racial inequality and really to deny any sort of open discussion, open anti-capitalist criticism, in those major, so-called opinion making type media. And so again, we saw various Black writers, Black academics who stepped forward to really push this idea that racial disparity was the main problem. And another dimension of it, and we're 20 years after the fact, but another dimension was the backdrop of the Katrina disaster, which provided us, with, again, a powerful narrative, even though a false one, that most of the people who were stranded in New Orleans back in August and September of 2005 were stranded because they were Black, right? And it was a function of institutional racism and not a failure of policymakers, both within the federal government, but also at the state and local level, to create an evacuation plan that would have accommodated people who didn't own cars, people who didn't have a ton of disposable income. And so, with Katrina and then the subprime mortgage crisis, and then with the election of Obama, the kind of space for this disparitarian rhetoric to really take hold, it just was there, right? It had a lot of traction within that context. And, again, we're still there. I mean, notice how after the January wildfires, I mean, before those fires were even brought under control, the same kind of narrative that had dominated the discussion of the Katrina disaster, right? The focus on the homeowners in the lower Ninth Ward. This became a big part of, celebrity, interventions in New Orleans, right? The tendency that the decision of celebrities like Brad Pitt to go in through his Make It Right Foundation and, rebuild homes, right? These were the kinds of people they were concerned about. They totally fucking ignored public housing residents, right? Who were scattered to the four winds, not allowed to move back into New Orleans. And they watched their, places that had been their home for some time demolished, right? Through, one of the last waves of Hope 6 demolitions. During the wildfires, we saw the same sort of narrative reemerge quickly, right? The focus quickly was around homeowners in the Altadena, area, which, I know people in Altadena that lost their homes, and I'm totally in support of them rebuilding. But again, it's a convenient thing within media, both mass media, but also, social media, to focus in on Black homeowners, right, as deserving victims, and then to ignore all the other renters in Los Angeles who are going to be displaced and priced out of, this post-fire market that's already taking shape. And so, this is just another. It's one way to focus on economy and on inequality, but it's still connected to an older set of civil rights discourses that just doesn't help, the vast majority of Black people who are working class and who are not homeowners. And it just doesn't necessarily help, people in the population more generally. So, again, there's all sorts of writers and, people working for foundations and various activist organizations who will, talk about racial disparity to the end of time, but they don't really have an answer for the kind of thing that we're witnessing right now in the midst of this Trump, Elon Musk regime that's been in place for the last few weeks.
Pascal, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, actually, how would we respond? How do you suggest actual leftists who are informed by egalitarian, socialist, and anti-capitalist politics form the kind of work that's necessary to challenge the politics of the moment, while all of the media thoroughfare or political thoroughfare is blocked up with the rad libs and even worse, liberals who are willing to sing, we have overcome in the well of the Congress, as if that's going to address what Trump is doing by cutting, social services to the population.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. So what should we do? I just got back from some time down in the really deep South. I was actually, in the Texas borderlands, McAllen, Texas, and Hidalgo County, San Benito, South Padre Island, those areas. And when I gave an address to a gathering of political scientists there, part of what I want to talk about is talked about red state socialism, right? Which seems like it is oxymoron to talk about it, right? And part of that talk was motivated by having grown up in a place that was not, it was not a radical place at all, right? We didn't have Marxist study groups. We didn't have radical bookstores. There were I didn't grow up around anybody who was a red diaper baby. There was none of that infrastructure. We really didn't have much in the way of unions, aside from teachers unions and a handful of people, in at least one industrial union, the oil, atomic, and chemical workers, right? So I think we have to think about how do we build in places like that, like the place where I grew up, right? Which Jason's really familiar with that place. How do we build in places like the Texas borderlands where none of that infrastructure exists? You're not going to gain any traction by coming in and talking about anti-capitalism as such. You're not going to get people to join some Marxist reading group. I mean, maybe a few around the campuses like University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. But it's not going to happen in the ways we see things happen in bigger cities like Chicago, LA, the Bay Area, New York, and what have you. And so I think those of us who want to mobilize at this particular moment have to make those hinterlands of the country a priority. And if not, places in red states, parts of the cities that we live in where people are not being touched by these various social movements, right? I just think that that's what's missing. There's too much of an amen corner in so many spots that I frequent on the left where people expect to talk a certain language. They want to get caught up criticizing people for not using the right pronouns or not necessarily, but for using the wrong term to describe somebody, or, there's all this sort of real weird discussion. And I'm not saying that, we shouldn't be concerned about, naming people in the ways that they want to be named. But if we're going to succeed in these parts of the country where Trump won, and that's one thing I should have said about the borderlands, right? Even though some of those counties are 90% Chicano, 90% Mexican, right? Trump still was victorious in those places. And we're not going to get there by writing them off as backwards, low information voters, all this other, these other epithets that we hear people use. We gotta spend our time finding out what people want, and also realizing that many of those same people, they want to have health care, right? They want to have a job that pays a decent wage. They want to have lower costs for education. They want their kids to have high quality schooling. And so they want some of the same things that we talk about, but we're not going to get there through ideological education, right? We're only going to get there by a long-term commitment to building in places like McAllen, like Brownsville, like Peoria, Illinois, or Opelousas, Louisiana, or other parts in this country that a lot of folks on the left has dismissed as flyover country, right? They see it, they have the same kind of condescension that these Democrats do, right? The mainstream Democrats. And so I just think that's where the frontier is for us on the left at this particular moment. Because if we were able to do that, if we're able to do something that was similar to what we saw during that Popular Front period, where, in that case, Democrats had to come up with solutions. I mean, partially because of the Depression, they had to come up with solutions for rural Americans, right? That's how we end up with all these various experiments in, modest land redistribution and the creation of places like the Dyess Colony in Arkansas, where Johnny Cash grew up. This is how we end up with, various public works projects that were involved across all congressional districts in the country. But, we just don't have that vision. I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. There's just general historical amnesia in the country. But there's also, there's some elite and urban, there's a kind of urban disdain for, for what exists beyond the city limits. I mean, and I'm saying it as a country boy who became an urbanist, right? And always was in these encounters with people who didn't know much beyond the city where they were located and really didn't care, right? But we got to change that. I mean, I remember having this conversation with people back during the George W. Bush years, and not much has changed since then. There's still, again, just a very much a urban bias, and it's not helping us at this particular moment, right? And we got to wrap our arms around a different kind of politics, and we're not going to get it from the rad libs, as Pascal makes clear.
Cedric Johnson situates Black Marxism within the Black intellectual culture of the Reagan-Bush era, characterized by race-first politics and skepticism of Western knowledge claims. How does this context influence Robinson's arguments?
It's odd, right? Robinson wrote that book. He was actually living for part of the time in England. And it's just a strange book to me. I mean, like I said, when I read it the first time, as a young person in my 20s, really, I was captivated by it in so many ways. Revisiting it now, it just seems like a strange argument to make. But I think at that point, maybe in fairness to Robinson, the sense was that communism had been, almost defeated, right? I mean, the process of liberalization had already started in China, right? I mean, it wasn't what it would become, but that process was already underway in terms of diplomacy and opening up to the West. And so I just think he makes an argument that could have been made by somebody who was more overtly anti-communist. And he makes an argument that, again, is built on, the things that have been said before, right? It's based on, I think there's a kinship to Cruz's Crisis of the Negro Intellectual in a lot of ways. I try to make that connection in the article, at least briefly. But it's consonant with with the sense in the 1980s, whether it's from Reagan or from Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative to capitalism, and Marxism certainly is dead. Right, that as an idea is pretty much dead. Only within the most radical corners of London and New York City and the major metropoles is it still being offered as an idea. What he does miss, and I want to go back to this because Pascal brought it up earlier, he doesn't quite reckon with the fact that so many Black intellectuals and activists and ordinary people across the Black Atlantic world, if you want to use that as a phrase, people in newly independent countries in Africa and the Caribbean were embracing socialism, right? They were embracing versions of it. And he doesn't really take that up. I mean, he alludes to it in a few places, but he doesn't give us a sense of where those experiments fit into this sense of a Black radical tradition. And I think that's a major problem for me. It's a problem because those were some of the most inspiring, especially for Black people in the US, they were inspiring projects. I mean, so much so that people who were able packed up their bags and they moved to Tanzania, right? They moved to Ghana. They moved to Guinea, right? And other places. And people took out their pocketbooks and supported anti-colonial struggles in Mozambique, in Angola, in in Guinea-Bissau, with Amilcar Cabral. And so I think it's an important moment globally where socialism is not dead. Even if the Soviet Union, has been rejected by many socialists in the United States at that point, 1970s and 80s, it's still very much alive in these, so-called third world contexts where, whether we're talking about Jamaica or Guyana,
Thomas
or
Sankara.
Burkina Faso, right? Of course, all of these places, they're still alive, right? In that moment that he's writing. And it's just tragic that he doesn't quite give us a sense of how they fit in. I think they're important for us now because anytime anybody begins to tell you that, somehow the Soviet Union was the only model or place that we should be looking towards. I mean, there's all sorts of other examples that we can find in the formerly colonial world, and they achieved great things, which is one thing I try to underscore in the article. And they didn't fail so much as they were defeated, right? They were defeated through various coups d'etat, through assassinations, Thomas Sankara being one of those. And we need to be clear about that, right? That these various regimes in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and Asia as well, posed a threat to Western dominance and, the interests of capital across the globe. And again, there's a lot that we can learn from that moment. It's actually a glorious moment and one that we should revisit over and again.
You want to follow up, Pascal?
I totally agree with you. It's something that's almost absent from the discourse you get from these new race reductionist socialists, and that you don't really hear the people of Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara. You don't hear about the Mozambiques. You don't hear that. Now you do get that from the contemporary revolutionary nationalists that we have today, like organizations like Black Alliance for Peace. They're very aware of the international global South Marxist and communist, Marxist-Leninist particular international order fighting imperialism. And they carry those banners proudly. But that's not the mainstream, what discourse you're hearing in academia and these foundations that's being covered in the New York Times or the Atlantic by any stretch of the imagination. You're hearing academics who are, carrying along that same, that same race reductionist, race first narrative of trying to explain what's going on. Sadly, my ultimate response to that is that what exactly are you challenging if you're just talking about racism all the time and you don't challenge capitalism? So what you're saying is that what you want is more black people included into a system that's destroying itself. Because as we know as people on the socialists, is that capitalism is actually an order in which the means of production destroy itself and cannibalizes itself to continue. So if we are talking about debating a mechanism to get more black people to be able to function or in a higher positioning in that system, then that's a liberal remedy for something that's eventually going to be suicide. Would you not agree with that, Cedric?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I'm of two minds, right? So let's take it to the recent debates around DEI, right? And for everybody in your audience, we know that DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it was an accommodation to the kind of changes that happened legally within higher ed, but also other aspects of society, given the challenges to affirmative action and the weakening of any kind of civil rights regulatory power in terms of anti-discrimination, right? And so DEI emerges as a
concession,
as a fix, a way of trying to still do the same things that people wanted to do, which is to hire, more black faculty if it was a university, or to admit more black students or students of color. That was the idea. Or programming, curriculum changes, other kinds of things. And so I say I'm of two minds because, I'm feeling it right now on my own campus where, when they come after DEI, they're not saying, "Oh, we're not going to go after the Black Marxist guy." They're actually coming after everybody who might be connected to Black studies or anything that they see as not productive in terms of majors and all the rest of it. And so this austerity that's happening right now, the threats that are being made on various campuses to make deep cuts, to consolidate programs, to get rid of contingent faculty. Of course, administrators are saying they're not doing that because of Trump, but these are things they have to do because of fiscal concerns. I have to experience all that as an academic and as a faculty member. And so there's a part of me that realizes that, I'm on the ship. And so even if I think that it is the Titanic, I still have to be concerned on some level about, what happens if I want to have a job. So there's that part. At the same time, and I said this to some of my friends recently, this idea that we should boycott, this boycott that we had, the blackout last week, where people were asked to not shop at the big box stores or any other store that had dissolved its DEI programming or hiring initiatives. I said to some folks recently that I thought, that was actually kind of nonsensical. And one, it's not a real boycott. It wasn't one that was, that was going to be sustained over time and really make these corporations feel it. One day just meant, okay, I'm going to shop for what I need on Thursday, not shop on Friday if that's the day that we're taking off from shopping, and then I'll just go back and get whatever I want on another day. I mean, that's not really how you really make your power felt. It was also nonsensical in this regard, and this brings us back to the class question, which I think is at the heart of Pascal's comments. We're asking people to boycott so that these companies hire more Black managers, right? That's essentially what we're saying. We're asking people to boycott, to not shop, so that they can hire more Black managers. And when I was in, again, in this tour I took through Texas and into Louisiana, I went into Walmart close to my mom's house when I was there. And 90% of the people shopping in that Walmart were Black. I would say probably 100% working in that Walmart, 100% of the workers were Black. And when you look at Walmart nationally, I'm not defending Walmart. It's a really, diabolical and terrible corporation on so many fronts, right? It's destroyed downtowns. It's killed a lot of small businesses. They squeeze their suppliers in so many ways. They don't pay people adequate wages. They circumvent environmental regulations and living wage ordinances in the places where they set up shop. So they're terrible. That's not my point to defend them. But again, we're asking people who rely on that corporation for a job. They hire more people, percentage-wise, more people of color than a lot of other corporations. And again, their base of customers is primarily working class, right? They're people who are trying to stretch their dollars in a high inflationary price gouging moment. And so I think it's asking people to choose representation over basic survival. And it wasn't a real response, but it's the kind of response we'd get from, Reverend Sharpton and all sorts of other folks who have their origins more so in the earlier civil rights moment, right? I just think we have to do more. And again, if we're serious about organizing the hinterlands of this country, right? The places, the small towns, the rural areas, the places that are left out of these conversations about the left, we got to think more carefully about how we orient towards, what life is like for people in small towns where, Walmart might be the only place you can really go that's close by, right? And so, I just think we have to be better about it. But the focus on DEI is I think in some moments it can be an important battle, depending on what campus you're on. But it also doesn't apply to a large swath of African Americans when it comes to higher education, right? So, if we're talking about admissions, I didn't have to worry about admissions going to a Black college, right? So then we're talking about schools that are predominantly white, and in particular, highly competitive schools where, Blacks and, all sorts of other groups are competing for the same seats that are finite. So again, it's the way in which we present this, the rad libs present it to us as though we should all be concerned about it. And it's really not everybody's concern. I mean, most people could care less because they're not going to go to Harvard. They're not going to go to Princeton. Their kids are not going to get admitted there. And so it's not their concern, right? Just like getting a job as a manager, a regional manager for Walmart is not on the horizon for them. They're trying to pay bills now, right? They're trying to do basic things. And so I just think we have to go beyond that. Again, DEI was a concession. It was a compromise. It was a quick fix in the midst of the rollback of civil rights regulation and anti-discrimination as a commonly held value coming out of the civil rights movement. And so I'm in favor of it on the level of where I work, right? I have to kind of think about what it might mean going forward as somebody in the Black Studies department. But in terms of the broader battles we're facing in this country, it's actually not that important. And it's certainly not more important than people who don't have the very basic means to survive.
What say you, Pascal?
Is there a reason to say more?
Yes. It's called filling time.
I think it was very eloquently put. Oh,
well, you're really bad at filling time. Last question. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us. This has actually been kind of a long time coming because you did write this. I think it got published in January, and
right at the end of January.
Scheduling is always difficult with you people.
Right. Right.
And by that, I mean Black academics. Always specific in my racism. You critique Robinson's reliance on a race essentialist understanding of epistemology. How might This approach limit analyses of capitalism and resistance movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the example of DEI, right? The underlying assumption is that we should all be concerned about these things because we're all going to be affected in the same ways, right? And that's the kernel of identity politics, right? It's the sense that somehow, if we're talking about Black people, because of a shared history and experience, have similar ways of knowing the world, similar perspectives, and shared interests, right? I mean, that's the core of it, and that's a falsehood, right? It's always been a falsehood. I mean, even during the Jim Crow period, we can certainly say that a vast majority of people had some interest in wanting full citizenship, but in some cases, we can find Black elites who didn't necessarily desire that for people who they saw as less educated and not as capable of being a citizen as they were, right? And so there's all sorts of divides in terms of class position, ideologies, discrete interests that people are pursuing at any given moment that divide the Black population during Jim Crow. Is certainly true now. And what Robinson does, right, when he embraces this idea that there's this epistemological aspect of Black life, he not only says it's so decontextualized, right? I mean, he's talking about it in so many different contexts where there's no way we could sustain that as a real idea without essentializing it, right? Without saying that it's something deeper underneath, whatever cultural practices there might be in one context, South Africa or Jamaica or the United States, that it's pretty much, that there's a tie that binds it all together. And again, that's an old Pan-Africanist idea. But I don't think that particular thread of Pan-Africanism is really helpful. I think it actually blinds us to real interests, real differences among us as a population, and allows us to really see where the political fault lines are, right? So I think that's one problem with it, this kind of like race essentialist understanding of epistemology, that it just conflates the experience of Black people with political life, which is something very different, right? I mean, we all know this, just in terms of our own experiences intuitively. You can grow up in the same conditions as somebody else, eat from the same plate, go to the same schools, share the same experiences in terms of sports and things that you're into as a young person, and be totally different from that person politically. I mean, we've all discovered that, once you mature. So there's something more dynamic about political life and how people come to their ideas, what they're willing to fight for, how they see themselves in the world and what kind of world they want, that just can't be captured in this kind of race essentialist set of frames we get from Robinson and a lot of the people who follow behind him. I mean, just one last example, and this might be helpful. There's moments when he makes the claim that, Africans, for instance, weren't as violent as Europeans, that Europeans were kind of intrinsically much more violent. And
what?
Right. And so this is like the kind of argument he's making. And I mean, I've heard people make that argument way before Robinson, right?
This is like some of the most like ridiculous form of race essentialist stuff that goes back to street corner nonsense you would hear on Jamaica Avenue or in Harlem or 125th Street.
Right.
This is literally like, and the ways of Urugu type stuff, and like or
look, Pascal, you can't teach. You only let me make those jokes because I can't. I told you they came looking for me that one day. San
What's
Francisco.
the
I gotta go back.
what's the Nation of Islam origins of Yaqub? I mean, that's
Yeah,
basically
Yaqub, that's it, right?
that's the same line of thinking that goes
Right.
that way. And
Yeah, no doubt.
We was peaceful kings.
hmm
I mean, do these people know the history of South Africa before Europeans came? I mean, what do you think? What was the relationship with the Zulu with the other tribes? Then, man, the Zulu were like a vicious tribe in terms of
They had regular negotiations like every other tribe. They just it was just a negotiation. They were excuse me, pardon me, sir. That's all it was. What are you talking about? That's Europeans, guns, germs, and steel.
I mean, of course, there are differences of scale because of the nature of the conflicts of Europeans and the diversity of Europe, plus the timing of the fact that Europe develops after the fall of the Roman Empire. You know, those things are going to have an effect on the growth of violence within the European context. To make the argument that, you know, Africa was simply a continent where people were just like, you know, selling Kopi shells and whatnot for cash. This is like ridiculous, man.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, and that's why I think, you know, authors like Walter Rodney, you know, Chinwezu, some of these other authors are more helpful for thinking about that moment, right? Because it's not something intrinsic about Europe that allows them to eventually dominate, you know, and colonize other parts of the world. It's really, as Rodney and other people point out, like Chinwezu, it's really the you know, the technological advancements through industrialization, right, and the development and mass production of arms and other things that make that possible, right? And so, you know, once those technological advances place them in a give them an upper hand when it comes to their negotiations and confrontation with people in other parts of the world, that's when we begin to see conquest. But even then, I mean, there's fierce battles, right, that people fight. The one that I talk about briefly is the first invasion of Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and the success of Menelik in beating back the Italians and really, you know, having a decisive defeat. You know, the Battle of Adwa, you know, is an important contradiction to or you know, a refutation of what Robinson says about this kind of, you know, sense that Africans are just intrinsically or culturally more peaceful. Yeah, it's just not helpful. But, you know, to Pascal's point, when you mentioned Urugu, you know, Marimba Ani's book, which was also popular in the 1990s, you know, Marimba Ani actually acknowledges Robinson in that book. In the acknowledgments, she actually thanks him for his work. And so his work, again, as I see it, is more consonant with Black nationalist ideas and a particular kind of Black nationalism, right? A kind of cultural nationalism that comes from Haki Madhubuti, you know, Maulana Karenga in an earlier manifestation, Amiri Baraka when he was in his cultural nationalist phase, and certainly a lot of the Afrocentric nationalists that come after, you know, in the 1980s and early 90s. His work fits within that context.
It's another form of racial vindicationism, man. When we were kings, we were great, or we are great people. We don't need this Marxism stuff to explain our condition. You know, it runs concurrent throughout all of that work, which I've been exposed to earlier in my life in college when I wasn't a Black nationalist, you know, throughout law school and whatnot. And
right,
it's I look at it as being like it's a dead end street. Like, what are you going to do with that? When's the race war? Then if all of this is true, when are y'all talking about signing up to start the race war?
Whoa, hold on. That's a white man's war. Hold on. Speaking of race war, Teray Reed and I had a very interesting conversation about Spike Lee versus Mario Van Peebles. And I believe in my soul that Spike Lee is responsible for putting the kibosh on the directing career of Mario Van Peebles.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I think he really hated his father.
Spike hated Melvin.
Yes. Yeah. I think he hated what Melvin brought with black exploitation cinema, because his goal was kind of in that. And I think he hated Mario because he was prettier than him. And Mario is
Did Spike really in black exploitation cinema though?
No, but he had a moment, right? Because Mario Van Peebles doesn't come up the same way Spike comes up, right? Spike comes up because white people said, okay, these movies or this movie's okay, and he gets a deal. Well, she's got to have it. Whereas Mario comes up a little differently. He's an actor, and then he makes these movies with like rappers. He actually tries to appeal to a quote unquote black audience. Spike, not so much.
Right.
So Spike tries to kill Mario Van Peebles. It's career. So if you're watching Spike, I know. We know. Posse should have been bigger. New Jack City should have had a sequel.
Right.
Nobody gave a fuck about niggas going to college other than you and Pascal. Mario's making movies for us. Got the kibosh because of Spike Lee. And I'm working on something that's going to explain how MTV has influenced quote unquote black culture negatively.
So no UMTV raps. Downtown Judy Brown.
They look, man. We can talk about it off air. Me and Teray was going on and on about it. We sounded like niggas in the barbershop, probably to most people.
Right.
Teray's not going to your barbershop, so.
Are you saying he can only go to like a white barbershop, like a hairstylist?
Oh man, he's going with the Latinos, man. Shots fired. Shots.
We coming for you, nigga.
I did not see that one coming, but no, it was a. I think he would have appreciated Pascal because he is on the same tip as Jeremiah. And I don't know if you guys agree with this, that there's this moment where the music industry pushes a certain kind of black music as officially black music, and R&B stops having instrumentation and everything is sample based and everything is hip hop, and black music is just hip hop.
That's actually true. It happens.
So we were kind of talking about that, and I was bringing it back kind of historically and why these things happened and different ebbs and flows in music, and there's things people don't even know about, like MTV, because most people think the first black video is Michael Jackson, and it's not. Actually, Grace Jones was played in '81.
Right.
And the first one in rotation is Pass the Dutchie, which comes out before
Pass the Dutchie upon the left hand side.
So it's
made by Don Letts, right?
Yeah.
He made that one. He did The Clash, a whole bunch of videos.
Yeah, Don Letts actually talks about there's some. When I'm done, I'll send it to you guys when I'm done. It's
okay.
Me and Teray have been going back and forth on this for a while. Our history of the Negro music turn when Luther Vandross was over.
Sounds like a show,
right? I think Cedric would be great on that show because he's got an encyclopedic knowledge on black music.
All things Negro.
It's called being a latchkey kid in the 80s, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. Like me and Teray had a debate. I'll ask you two about it because you guys got me by a couple of years. We were having a debate, and I was like, Terrence Trent D'Arby did not get broke on MTV. He got broke on BET, and after Wishing Well blew up, then MTV played it.
That's a guy who I always wanted to speculate what happened to his career because he was so talented, man.
Terrence Trent D'Arby?
Yeah.
He said something
He's
about
still making music.
He is, just not to the same level. He pissed some people off.
And he changed his name too, so he doesn't have the same name. So he's harder to find, right? If you're looking for Terrence Trent D'Arby, you're not gonna find his music.
He said he was the greatest entertainer of all time in it was 87.
Wow.
Hit. And
I'll tell you one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I always thought he was like British or something, right? By the way, the way he present. No, he's not. He's American.
Where's he from? Baltimore?
I think not Baltimore, somewhere else, like maybe Florida or something.
Totally blew my percentage.
But the kind of the case in point,
he's not British.
There's a moment where black music has a working class aesthetic to it, especially adult contemporary. We're going to call it adult contemporary stuff, right? Jokingly, we call it black yacht rock, but let's call it adult contemporary for all intents and purposes.
You saying like the Alexander O'Neal era?
Alexander O'Neal era. Like I said, Luther, Anita Baker, Jeffrey Osborne, right?
No doubt. No doubt.
These guys are kind of making songs as their white contemporaries are making songs that are kind of aimed at the boomers still. That's still the market that everybody wants to hit because they're buying records. And as they're getting older, these are like more complex songs about relationships and love. The end of that kind of ends that music. And it's just the Jodeci era, kind of post New Jack Swing stuff. By that time, that music is just done. And a certain working class aesthetic to black music is gone. So black music is just inner city urban music, right? So it's just real over the top vulgar and then hyper violent. Mary J. Blige, originally marketed as the queen of the ghetto, but thank you, Andre Harrell, for putting the kibosh on that with Puffy, and she becomes the queen of hip hop soul, whatever the fuck that is. And you just see this kind of erasure of an entire kind of working class aesthetic that happens in black music that existed for a long time, and it's just gone.
Sam Jason talking like he takes that shit personally. It's like, y'all motherfuckers robbing me.
I wanted another Anita Baker record, man. You know,
she was also very talented back then too.
But what fucking happened to Albie Shore? Took Albie Shore away from us,
right?
You know, the crossover we needed was Albie Shore, Kenny Loggins. That would have fucking made the world a better place. Didn't get it.
You know what else happened though? Like, there's also the way that certain artists, like remember the brothers from Full Force.
Yeah.
The Haitian brothers. I know Pascal knows them guys.
They're Haitian?
Yeah.
The beat up kid?
Was it Paul Anthony, right? Those guys. They went on to become major writers. Like I think they wrote like a lot of the material. Yeah, for like
Lisa.
But even a lot of those white groups like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, some of those early groups, they wrote a lot of the music for those groups. So yeah, some strange changes that happened within music, like the end of the 1980s. Early 90s.
Think about we were talking about her. What's her name? Mariah Carey's first record is an adult contemporary pop album. Vision of Love. Does it get more adult contemporary pop than that? That second record, Fantasy. ODB remixes.
Right.
It's a very different scene. Music changes real hard. And MTV definitely embraces that. And that becomes black music. I mean, some people are like, what about jazz? It's like, yeah, right. How many people fill up a jazz club? I live down the street from a jazz club. That place is really small. And wasn't a lot of Negroes in it. You know, blues club, same thing. Who's going? I don't even think Biscuits and Blues exists anymore in San Francisco. So, you know.
Yeah, you can get some good tourist blues here in Chicago.
Tourist.
There's like a couple of spots you go in and it's like the only black person will be like the person on the stage.
Right? That it's just what it is. So I mean, we have to be honest with what we call even record labels. They kind of hindered a certain growth at a certain point in time of black music, especially kind of banning artists that were white. That like there's a reason why a lot of black people don't know what is his name? Bobby Caldwell is white because that video never got played.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just found out recently that on his first album, he actually drew the picture of himself as like his silhouette.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want to show like who he was. You know, I guess his record label didn't think it was gonna fly.
It was a different time.
Wait a minute, Jason. You telling me you don't think Kendrick Lamar just rescued black music with the Super Bowl performance?
Rap music is rap music, right? No, it's if you think about it, another reason why these cats were making a certain style of adult contemporary was because adult contemporary was just popular in the late 70s, early 80s. If you just go look at the charts and see what was hitting, you're like, okay, well, if that's hitting, then we have to make songs that sound like that. That's just how the needle moves. And there were some amazing black records, but I shouldn't say black records. There's some amazing records that came out by black artists. The record that predates Thriller is The Dude by Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones starts to work with Toto. And he brings Toto in to do Thriller for Michael Jackson, which is the biggest record of all time. And I don't think we're ever going to see a record like that for several reasons. We don't have a monoculture. We don't have a thing like MTV or terrestrial radio that's going to make a celebrity that large.
Right. It's too much fragmentation.
Way too much. And there's too much hyper categorization in music, right? And you can hear, and with the algorithms, you can kind of get whatever you want all the time, opposed to this guy that makes this record that kind of has a little bit of everything for everyone in a way that we haven't seen. And a lot of artists try to copy that and no one really can hit. Lionel Richie comes somewhat close, but no one can hit like those guys all did. You know, those white guys working with those black guys made the greatest record of all time. And I think all of that cooperation goes out the door definitely by the 90s.
Yeah, that's the last gasp of mass culture, right? The 80s. I mean, Cosby Show, we could have a conversation about that too. You know, everybody watched that, right? There was a lot of shows that everybody watched because there wasn't a whole lot of choices. But yeah, that's out now. We're living through a period of major fragmentation. But
there's some great music that comes out of that era because people are all willing to work together just to make, you know, dope stuff. Even in the early days of hip hop, you have lots of different kinds of people getting together to make dope stuff. So it can be a show topic. Pascal, do you have anything to say in closing?
I want to tell Cedric, thank you very much for coming out, man. I appreciated the conversation, brother. You know, you're definitely one of my favorites within the realm of academia, man, because usually these black academics are on some fatback and biscuits bullshit. So, I mean, for me, you know, the few you guys that are out there that are holding up the torch ought to be appreciated.
Well, I appreciate it, brother. Feeling is mutual. Glad to have a chance to be on here with you guys. Sorry it took so long to get me on here, but let's make it happen again soon.
All right. Me and Teray got to loop you into the black music conversation, Sid.
Yeah, sure thing.
and my Mario Van Peebles Spike Lee theory.
Okay.
I think like with everything else, black music is still alive. It's just British guys that's doing it. You know, British folk.
Doing it better.
No doubt.
You know, I was
No
at
doubt.
the last cat I heard. I'll leave you with this. There's a young man named Aloe Black,
Oh yeah.
and he came in the studio I was living in to do a little small festival. And I don't know if people know this, but a lot of times when singers come in to town, they have to work with a band that day. And that band's been practicing the stuff, but they don't have like cues down. So he was trying out a band and kind of picking people that day because he wasn't big enough to fly with his own guys. And he was walking through the hallway just singing. And he had maybe one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard come out of a human being. My God, because he couldn't have been more than 20 something at that time and had just a richness to his voice. I don't know if he's still doing music right now, but I was just totally stunned by his range and I don't know, he's just a cool dude and was just really, really talented. So there's some talented Americans out there. I just, there's too many.
Yeah.
Too many. I don't know where to even look for music anymore. All right, guys, let's end with some cartoons. Thank you, Ced. Wherever you guys are watching, listening to the show. Wherever you guys are watching, listening to the show, there is a link in the description of Cedric's article. It's literally the first line in the description to the non-site article. And I'll just see you guys in the champagne room. Pascal, good night. Cedric, good night. Everybody that's not joining us in the champagne room, you're missing out. We are out.